our first guest, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. So we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion, I can assure you, and you don't want to miss it. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We'll be right back.
Spartans! What is your profession? You see, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. Remember, this is a live broadcast, so if you're just tuning in now or you're coming in late, you can always catch us on the podcasting platforms after the show. This will be syndicated on iTunes, also on Spotify, and Stitcher, and so many other platforms. You can, no matter where you're listening, or in your smart TV with iHeartRadio, you'll be able to find this show. Just search Sunday Wire on the Alternate Current Radio Network, and you'll find us there. Also at ACR's website, alternatecurrentradio.com. You can see us along with all the other amazing programs there at ACR, the greatest independent radio network online. Now, our next guest, special guest joining us this week, his name is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, and he is also the author of a new book, Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. Marcus is joining us on the live link right now. Hello, Marcus.
Good evening, Patrick. And can I say, first of all, how delighted I am to be on your show.
Thank you very much. And it's been a while, but we actually ran into each other online on another program not so long ago on Crosstalk, which is hosted by Peter Lavelle on RT International. And we just got in scraping the surface of a really interesting conversation. I could see your interest was peaking just when the show was finishing. You were commenting on this situation we find ourselves in, this new normal, which is neither new nor is it normal, but it's definitely not new. This is a cycle that we're going through, as cycles have happened in the past in history. And as a historian, I think you're pretty well placed to step back and look at this from a bigger perspective. And first of all, transformative things are happening in finance, in culture, in politics, and not necessarily for the better on many fronts. And so I just want to pass this over to you. What are your initial impressions of the last 18 months, Marcus?
Well, I should first of all say, Patrick, that as a historian, history teaches us that all is possible and that all is impermanent. Indeed, history teaches us that there has never been a golden age or a golden period in the history of mankind. Further to that, history teaches us that the world goes round in phases. It is abundantly clear to me and to a great many other people, wherever they reside in the world, that the world today in 2021 is a very unwell world. However, it doesn't mean that it will always be like this. Now, turning to what the world has been witness to since the beginning of 2020, I am disgusted by the changes which have been imposed on a great many societies around the world. But I have to say, Patrick, I am not at all in the slightest bit surprised. Firstly, I am not surprised that some of the most powerful of people in the world, and I'm principally referring to Western elites, have taken advantage of a situation which is known as COVID-19 to attempt to transform the world to a state that suits their interests and their interests only. They would not be the first group of elites in history who have attempted to do that. Secondly, I am not at all surprised by the very significant advances that the aforementioned elites have accomplished for themselves, not for you, Patrick, not for myself, not for any other ordinary person in the world, for themselves. I am not surprised by how they have achieved so much since the start of 2020. Why am I not surprised? Because if I'm talking about Western society, over the last 30 years, and especially in the last 20 years, Western society has become more decadent than it has ever been before in contemporary times. The average man and woman in both Britain and America and Canada and Australia and indeed New Zealand are more interested in celebrity culture and reality television than they are in what is happening in their local communities and their societies as a whole. Therefore, their acceptance of the changes which have been imposed on them, and they have been imposed on them, or their acquiescence in the changes which have been imposed on them, comes as no surprise, because the cognitive capacity of the average person in the West is at an appalling level. But also, as I said moments ago, the interest in what is happening around themselves is almost nil. They are more interested in decadent television shows such as Strictly Come Dancing and X Factor, and indeed even a new show which was broadcast only recently by Channel 4 News, by Channel 4, which ultimately encourages married couples to engage in orgies. That is what the average person in the West is more interested in. So therefore, Patrick, I am not in the slightest bit surprised by the accomplishments of the Western elites since the start of 2020. And I should add as well, Patrick, that who do I hold ultimately responsible for the new abnormal? Not the new normal, it's a new abnormal. Who do I hold ultimately responsible? Well, I will tell you, I don't hold the Western elites ultimately responsible. People throughout history, elites throughout history, have always had diabolical agendas. That is simply a reality of human beings. There will always be abhorrent human beings living amongst us, including those who will reach the very pinnacles of power in society. But I don't hold them responsible for what has happened. They have a diabolical agenda, and that diabolical agenda should have been met, and should have been met head on by the average man and woman in the West, and indeed anywhere in the world. No, Patrick, I hold the average person responsible, because their willingness to go along with the changes, or those who acquiesced to the changes, have ultimately brought this grotesque state of affairs, not just on themselves, but on everyone else. And also they have brought this grotesque situation on future generations as well.
Yes, yes. I mean, we had a conversation with Dr. Mark Changizi a couple weeks ago, and he talked about this provable phenomenon, which is that what you're describing, Marcus, is this ability to co-opt the population and to make the agenda come from the bottom up, to engineer it so that it comes from the bottom up using decades of propaganda, now through the smartphone devices, through social media, the digital channels, and so forth, and getting the people, the masses, to adopt this lack of moral values, this kind of short-term thinking, funneling their attention into ever narrow channels and pipelines. And so, and they're clamoring, they're cheering for censorship on social media. We could have knocked this on the head back in March, April 2020, if free speech was allowed on social media, because the facts would win out. Certainly, if you look at the opposition to these agendas, whether they be lockdowns or mandatory vaccines or vaccine passports, absolutely the facts are with the dissenters. The data, the truthfulness and the integrity in terms of how data is presented, it's definitely with all of these skeptic groups and these various confabs that have formed, putting out really good stuff. You've seen it on Twitter. Every minute it's coming out. But the mainstream media has firewalled it, and social media is physically suppressing anything that goes against the WHO or the government public health guidelines and so forth. So, and that's created this kind of bizarre bottom-up situation where, like you said, the average man and woman is absolutely not just okay with it. They're cheering for it. It's an extraordinary situation, Marcus.
Well, Patrick, one could describe the average man and woman in, for example, Britain as a mindless slave. But at the same time, Patrick, you could also describe the aforementioned person as a willing slave. That is what is so remarkable about the state of affairs in Britain and in the West in general. The manipulation of public opinion is a practice which goes back many, many centuries. Indeed, it goes back to ancient times. What we have witnessed in Britain since the start of 2020 is not unprecedented. However, what, in my opinion, is potentially unprecedented, and I emphasize the word potentially, is the willingness, the acceptance of vast numbers of people to place their trust regarding their health and their lives in general in the hands of politicians and journalists who are, at the end of the day, human beings who have ideologies, who have a view of the world, and who have interests, other interests, which they will pursue. That is what is so startlingly astonishing about what I describe as neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism obviously didn't start at the beginning of 2020. It's emerged in its cultural form, really, in essence, in the late 1990s in Britain and also in America. And one of the most tremendously successful aspects of neoliberalism has been to control people's minds to the extent that people are not willing to say words or to act in a certain way which is in the interests of themselves and their family members. That is what is so particularly astonishing about neoliberalism and what we have seen in Britain and in the rest of the Western world since the start of 2020. And I believe that it is largely on account of how successive British administrations, successive American administrations in the last 30 years, but particularly in the last 20 years, have introduced such degenerate ways into British and American societies, have made the average person in the UK and the US so, quite frankly, stupid, that it is only inevitable that after so many years, such people will not be able to think independently, and worse still, will not be able to think critically. That is how the changes in, for example, Britain have been imposed so quickly and so successfully in a matter of some 18 months, because the British people are far from being an enlightened people. They will accept more or less anything that their politicians and journalists tell them to, providing they have their television programs, providing they have their glossy magazines, providing they have their television sets. The average man and woman in the UK is not just content, but is happy. And yet, what they don't realise is that they have walked into a furnace, and they haven't just taken themselves into a furnace. They have, or they may very well take the rest of us into that furnace with them.
Yeah, it is quite extraordinary to get people to act against their own interest, do that voluntarily, and to have that happening en masse. And yeah, I think this is the culmination, as you've said, decades and decades of gradually dumbing down of society, not just in Britain and in the U.S. I think straight across the West, but it's particularly chronic in certain Western countries. I mean, what we're seeing in Canada and Australia is just incredible, quite frankly, but they're kind of on the same page culturally as all of these, especially in the Anglo-American sphere. Everyone's more or less on the same page, but the weaponization of applied behavioral psychology in recent years, governments, especially Britain is a perfect example. They've invested hundreds of millions, if not billions, into this technology, to nudging units, and you're probably familiar with all the amount they're spending on COVID advertising. They pretty much own the mainstream media by virtue of being their biggest advertising client now, subsidizing the corporate media. So not surprised how this is one giant sort of system that's been pointed at the public. You just have to look at the newsstand every day. But I think, Marcus, that's the disturbing thing, is this really sophisticated applied behavioral psychology, the nudging, the sort of getting people to change their behaviors without them even knowing it. And even people within government have boasted about this. Years ago, nobody took much notice of it because they just thought, oh, well, that's a little bit nefarious, but we still live in a free society, and that might be a Labour or a Tory government, and we'll just vote them out the next election if you happen to be particularly offended by that program. But it's actually persisted, and it's been it's taken root in government at the highest levels of power. These are military technologies as well that have been deployed in overseas war theaters and things like that are actively being deployed against domestic populations. The same methods, the same technology. But what are your thoughts on that side of things?
Indeed. And those practices amount to crimes against humanity. And allow me to focus on the British establishment, because it is the British establishment which is the power base in Britain. It is not the House of Commons. It is not the House of Lords. It is not the Prime Minister. It is the British establishment, and specifically the very centre of the British establishment. How would I define the centre of the British establishment? Well, at the heart of the centre of the British establishment is the monarchy, followed by the aristocracy, then the upper echelons of the military, the upper echelons of the intelligence services, followed by the media elites and the business elites and the academic elites. To understand what has been happening in Britain since the start of 2020, to truly understand, one must understand the real structure of power in Britain. Britain, as we know, is officially a constitutional monarchy. But a constitutional monarchy is a figment of the imagination of the British establishment. So as we know, a constitutional monarchy was introduced in Britain in the 19th century. And we are told that the monarch does not play a role in the day-to-day running of Britain and effectively has no powers. Yet that is preposterous nonsense. The concept constitutional monarchy is the typical language of British officialdom, which the British establishment has employed over centuries. It is very colourful language. It is very deceiving language. And that is why the British establishment has been entrenched in power for many, many centuries. Because are we really going to believe that the monarch in the 19th century in Britain voluntarily surrendered their powers in favour of a parliament and a prime minister? No leader, Patrick, voluntarily gives away their powers. That's just a reflection on human beings. It's as simple as that. But I say this, Patrick, because I believe it's imperative for your listeners to understand that the heart of the British establishment, and I mean the heart, I don't mean the average journalist on the Guardian newspaper or the Times or BBC or Sky News. I mean the heart such as the monarchy and the aristocracy. They are the cleverest, the shrewdest, the most deceitful of all the establishments in the world. And the very fact they remain entrenched in power demonstrates that. And I believe that people also need to understand that their levels of intellect is also superior. Their mastery of human psychology is unrivaled. And I believe that it is no coincidence that what we have seen in the world, specifically in the Western world over the last 18 months or so, has really come from the Anglo-Saxon world. Of course, the Anglo-Saxon world is Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. One can go as far as to say that America is an extension of British global power, is an extension of the British establishment, is an extension of the city of London. And it is because of that extraordinary influence and power and intellect that the British establishment wields in the world and has wielded for centuries now, that we have seen them introduce a state of affairs, not just in Britain, but in other countries, as I said, such as America, Australia, and Canada, whereby people have succumbed almost overnight to the imposition of ways which are utterly detrimental to the ordinary person in the Western world. And of course, the British establishment has long engaged in making its people ignorant, in giving its people just enough to keep them content, to keep them from becoming revolutionaries. And of course, in the last 30 years, and especially the last 2 decades, it is no coincidence that on many decadent shows in Britain, such as Strictly Come Dancing, that British politicians have taken part in that. That is a subliminal way of telling the British public that it is perfectly acceptable to be watching these programs, when of course you and I, Patrick, and anyone else with even an ounce of enlightenment will know that it is not perfectly acceptable to watch such programs, to read magazines which are all about Hollywood celebrities, for example, having extramarital affairs or engaging in orgies or drug taking. And let me add this as well, Patrick. Did either yourself or any of your other listeners believe that the day would come in Britain or in America, let's focus on Britain and America, when a hardened criminal who broke into the home of a pregnant woman and threatened to kill her by jabbing a gun to her stomach would be idolized, would be worshipped by so many people in both British society and American society? And of course, I am talking about George Floyd. Whoever thought, Patrick, that a man who threatened to do that to a pregnant woman, I should add a pregnant black woman, but most importantly of all, a pregnant woman, would be idolized by people? I think if you went back 20 years, that would be inconceivable in both America and in Britain. But alas, that is exactly what has happened. And even more striking is how many women, how many mothers in America and in Britain idolize a man who broke into the home of a pregnant woman and threatened to kill her by jabbing a gun to her stomach. What is wrong with the minds of these women, of these mothers, to idolize such a man? But then it also takes me to this, Patrick. There are very many people in Britain who oppose the idolization of George Floyd. But do they take any definitive action? No. So, for example, most football fans are against this mandatory taking of the knee and the advertisements in football stadiums of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yet, if they cancelled their Sky Sports subscriptions, if they cancelled their season tickets, then overnight the finances of Sky Sports, the finances of the football clubs in the UK would be in peril, and they would back off from placing in football stadiums slogans about BLM and the mandatory taking of the knee. That's all that would be required, Patrick, on behalf of football fans. But do they do that? No, they don't. Because they can't live without Sky Sports. They can't live without sitting in a pub with a pint in their hand, watching a game of football. That is how pitiful and how dangerous British society has become.
bread and circuses, as the Romans said, they need their
Absolutely.
bread and circus. I'll go further. They didn't just idolize George Floyd. He was canonized. He's literally made into a kind of quick, fast food drive-through modern day saint, secular saint. And there's a lot of other things that he was involved in. That he made porn films. He did all sorts of stuff. That's just fact. That was never mentioned in the media. All this stuff, the gang robbery you're talking about, holding a gun to a pregnant woman's stomach to get money or to tell her where the valuables are. And he did time for that. He was convicted, multiple felon. And, that's just the tip of the iceberg on that one. But it's almost like the mob, the media, the political establishment, especially the way it is in America right now, they can coalesce around an incident like that and frame it a certain way, and then boom, this thing's in motion, and you literally can't stop it. It's incredibly, it's volatile, but it's also, of course, very dangerous, because once it happens, it sets a precedent that this is okay. This is what you do. You need to get behind it, even if there's problems with it. The mob's going in that direction anyway. I don't know if you're familiar, Marcus, with a book called The Fourth Turning. That's William Strauss and Neil Howe. I think it's the late 90s. And it predicted the demise of Anglo-American society that's following these civilizational cyclical patterns, and where it grows to a certain extent and has a certain amount of success, and then it begins to eat its own tail and turn in on itself. And this is throughout history, down to multiple factors. You know where I'm going here: corruption, ideological forces or trends or fashions. They erode the moral basis of the society, and things became unraveling very quickly. Senseless wars on the periphery of the empire and so forth. So as a historian, I'm sure you can point to a few historical examples of this sort of thing happening. Do you think that we're witnessing that in terms of Western civilization, this kind of cycle that's inevitable, that comes really from success? It comes from victories in the Second World War and so forth, and gaming the international financial system and so forth. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, I describe the West as the sick man of the world. And I believe that the West has been in decline for many years now, morally in decline, culturally in decline, and spiritually in decline. There was, of course, a time when Britain and America could claim at home, not abroad, but could claim at home that their respective societies were moral, were cultural, and were spiritual. So, for example, in America, prior to the 1970s, you would not find a Hollywood film which contained scenes of violence or extreme violence, or the use of profanities, or sexual scenes. Indeed, it was just about acceptable in American films before the 1970s for a man to kiss a woman on the cheek, or for a woman to kiss a man on the cheek. So that demonstrates how very, very different American society was then compared to now. And if I turn to Britain, I believe that the changes, or the foundation for societal changes in the UK, were laid in the 1960s. In particular, with the emergence of what was then called a feminist movement. It was not a feminist movement. These people were not feminists. The true feminists were the suffragettes. But these people in the 1960s, these so-called feminists, were campaigning arduously for the contraceptive pill for women, partly because they said women should be allowed to be sexually promiscuous as men are. Now, I find sexual promiscuity abhorrent, but I think there's something in particularly worse about it when it concerns women. And I cannot come to comprehend why women, a very small minority of women in Britain in the 1960s, would have campaigned for the contraceptive pill, partly on the basis of allowing women to essentially have many different male partners. So it was at that time in Britain in the 1960s when the foundation for societal change was laid. And of course, in America and in Britain, much has happened since the late 1960s and the early 1970s. We have seen the deterioration of the church in both countries. We have seen the deterioration of cultural values in both countries. The morals in both countries have completely changed. And I simply do not want to refer to the morals in Britain or America today, because they are not morals. Perhaps we can call them neoliberal morals or neoliberal values, but we can't call them values. We can't call them morals because the manifestation of these so-called morals and values is absolutely repugnant. But again, it goes back to what I said earlier on in our discussion. The ultimate way to control a population is partly by making them, in colloquial terms, stupid, and also by taking away their cultural identification, their spiritual identification, and ultimately their national identity. If you take away a person's national identity, their cultural identity, their spiritual identity, if you take away the morals and values which had been bestowed on them by their ancestors, then that person, man or woman, no longer has an identity, because what can they identify with? That is a fundamental reason, Patrick, as to why so many people in both Britain and America are absolutely fixated with reality television and celebrity culture and media personalities whom they think are their friends, when of course they are anything but their friends. They are fixated with these groups of people because they do not have anything to identify with. They no longer go to church. They rarely play a role in their local communities. They are not truly interested in what is happening in their societies. They are simply interested in which celebrity is marrying the other celebrity, which footballer has ended up in trouble because he was caught drinking whilst under the influence of alcohol. They're more interested in putting on their television sets on a Saturday night and watching Strictly Come Dancing, for example, at a time when in Britain there are 14 million people living in poverty, including 4 million children living below the breadline. when there are such hideous changes occurring in British society, when British society can no longer be described as free and democratic. And yet, these people are quite content to watch their television programs, such as Strictly Come Dancing, with the knowledge, and yes, Patrick, some of them do know about poverty levels in Britain. Some of them are aware of these dreadful changes which have been imposed on the back of what is known as COVID-19. Some of them are aware, but they don't care because they have become incredibly stupid. They are incredibly individualistic, and therefore they don't care about their next door neighbour anymore. They don't fear God anymore. That is another reason why crime levels are soaring in Britain, especially in London, because no longer do criminals or would-be criminals fear the criminal justice system in Britain. I mean, criminal justice system, it's laughable. There's no deterrent in the criminal justice system in the UK. But no longer do they not fear the criminal justice system in Britain. They don't fear God, because the British establishment, the core of the British establishment, has deliberately eroded the role of the church in Britain as another way of ultimately controlling the minds of the people whom they rule over.
Yeah, I will argue that it's an illusion of individualism, or you're allowed to have certain affectations of individualism. But if you look at the group think, that the sort of the establishment has done a genius job of weaponizing this collectivist idea of the greater good. You know, comply, follow the, lockdown, wear your mask, get your vaccine, do it for the greater good. Don't do it for yourself. In fact, you're doing it to protect others. They've even taken that sort of collective mantra to another level. They've spun it in a whole another aspect to it, which is that you're not wearing the mask for your own protection. You're actually doing it to protect others.
Indeed.
Or you're not getting the vaccine for others. I mean, have you noticed this is absolutely an ingenious device for control.
Can I very quickly interrupt you, Patrick, because you've brought up the subject matter of face coverings. And I want to just cite one example, and you will be aware, and undoubtedly many of your listeners in Britain, in America, and other parts of the world will be aware of how nonsensical and how idiotic what I'm going to say is. So, last year in Britain, and for a large part of this year, there was a rule about people frequenting restaurants. To enter a restaurant, a person had to wear a face covering. They would have to walk to their table wearing a face covering. But once they sat down, that face covering could come off, and therefore they were safe. How laughably, monstrously idiotic that is. And worse still, Patrick, how depressing that so many people in Britain went along with that. Because I am not a medical doctor. I am not a scientist. I am not a virologist. But I do have some common sense relating to matters of health and science. In that, if you are sitting or standing in an enclosed space, in an enclosed room, breathing in and breathing out the same air, then why would you be made to wear a mask upon entering a restaurant and upon walking to your table, but not after you have sat down at your table? How are you going to be protected from a virus if you are sitting in an enclosed room, breathing in and breathing out the same air? It defies all belief that you are protected from the front door of a restaurant to the table, and as soon as you sit down at the table, you're fine. It's almost as if you are breathing in different air once you have sat down at a table. This is how monstrously idiotic the whole concept is. And on top of that, I would add this, that some people believe that a face mask, which has cost perhaps 1 pence or 2 pence to manufacture in China, is going to protect them against what we have been told is a bubonic plague, serves as a somber demonstration of how cognitively devoid, of how intellectually devoid, of how common sense devoid societies in Britain and America have become.
Yeah, the answer to that initial question, Marcus. It's become a ritual sacrament. So this has become kind of a secular religion. So it's about as effective as a necklace of bones, or having the old rabbit's foot. You remember the old rabbit's foots? That's probably just about giving you the same amount of protection. So this is clearly driven by fear, a trauma-based fear. This is mass hysteria. So, I mean, you probably thought about this. You probably looked back in history and you probably thought, is there anything in parallel, any example or any situation in history where mass hysteria or just some crazy ideas took hold for however long, whatever period of time, and that was used in order to maybe perhaps used by elites to increase control or transform the laws of the country or society, or prepare it for a state of war, or to pillage it or something like that. Certainly there's got to be a few examples. Can you think of anything off the top of your head in terms of some kind of example that's comparable? I know it's much bigger now and this is globalized, but have you thought about that?
I certainly have. And as I said earlier on in this discussion, throughout the time of history, the manipulation of public opinion has occurred by the ruling elites. If we are to talk about in more contemporary times, we saw that in fascist societies, we saw that in communist societies, we saw that in capitalist societies, be it conservative societies or liberal societies. There are many, many examples of that in contemporary times and also throughout the history of mankind. There are always, wherever you find human beings, Patrick, there will always be rivalry, there will always be crime, there will always be diabolical agendas. And I suppose if people want to confront someone with that stark reality about human beings, and perhaps they should confront, or perhaps they should consult God about that. But what I am saying in practice is that it doesn't matter if a human being labels themselves as capitalist, as liberal or conservative or communist or fascist or socialist or anything. In order to preserve their power base, in order to expand their power base, they will always look to manipulate public opinion at various levels, yes. But it doesn't matter. Human beings will always, or most human beings, wherever they are in the world, will always look to preserve their power base and to expand their power base through a number of means, including creating, as you said, mass hysteria. That is the way it always has been in the world, and that is the way it always will be. It's a sad reflection of many human beings, but alas, there's nothing we can do about that per se. However, the difference is this. Whereas before, People, for example, in America and Britain, had a strong identity. They had a strong cultural identity, a strong spiritual identity. They fought for themselves. They didn't intrinsically trust what they were told by politicians and journalists. They would question, they would think independently, and most important of all, they would think critically. That was how it was before. That is not how it is today in the Western world. And that is why it is so very, very dangerous now. Because there will always be, as I outlined earlier, there will always be politicians and journalists with diabolical agendas. Indeed, I would go as far as to use diabolical in its actual sense, in its actual religious sense. You will always find those people, Patrick. But before, those people could have been brought down from power. They could have been exposed. People could have defied them. But that's not what we see happening today. People are either willing slaves, happy slaves, or mindless slaves, providing they have what the British establishment, for example, has given them to keep them happy, providing they hear Churchillian words being uttered by their prime ministers. We will fight this together like we did in World War II. Then they will continue to think all is fine in Britain, when all is not fine in Britain.
The Blitz spirit, invoking the Blitz spirit.
Well, let me very quickly say something about that, Patrick. Following the fall of France to Nazi Germany in the summer of 1940, Churchill in public sought to keep British morale going by saying, we will fight them on the land, we will fight them at sea, we will fight them in the air. And that was necessary. But in private, London was speaking with Berlin about a potential truce in which Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, would be offered parts of the British Empire in return for a truce and a pledge by Hitler that Britain would not be invaded. So what Churchill was saying in public was not what he was saying in private. Now, if I said that to the average British person, they would find it incomprehensible. Indeed, they would say, Marcus, you are completely unpatriotic. Well, again, their sense of patriotism is very different to my sense of patriotism. My sense of patriotism is protecting the average man and woman in Britain from all malignant things which exist, and especially the most vulnerable, protecting children, women, and the elderly. That's my sense of patriotism. However, their sense is to simply sit in front of their television set with a pint of beer in their hand, going along with the slogans of BLM, going along which is being imposed on them and their children across society as a whole in Britain. Even though it's detrimental to them, they simply go along with it, and they have the audacity to say they're patriotic. These people are not patriots. They are naive, willing fools.
Well, it reminds me of that in Plato's Republic, the concept of the noble lie. And so this is a concept that the elite class, or the elite managerial class, the political class, you could say, or at the very top, they would justify the actions, even though they were deceptive. They would justify it as it's really it's like bad medicine. It's necessary because there are sort of bigger threats, bigger existential threats, and the people, if they really knew the truth, they wouldn't know how to handle it, and they might panic. So the Plato invoked in the dialogue on metals, invoked the noble lie. And so that brings us to, what is the noble lie in terms of the COVID the global pandemic, the new normal, I do see, and I'm not alone, of course, that a certain of these elite people who are well steeped in money and influence, they might be mid-level in terms of the real power structure. I'm talking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as an example. There is definitely an ideological streak within certain elite circles, these new global elites that view themselves as stewards of the planet. And throughout history, and I'm sure you're very well aware of the rise of the eugenics movement and the Malthusian movement, which from the time of H.G. Wells and the Rhodes Round Table and Huxley and so forth, this Bertrand Russell and this kind of elite cadre of British intellectuals, that there's this idea that one is the classic eugenics, and the other is that there's too many people on the planet. They followed Thomas Malthus. His idea is that we'd run out of food by 1980, or whatever the geometric growth of the population, which turned out to completely be false. In fact, most of the planet's in a negative birth rate at the moment. It's peaking and will eventually decline mathematically, and this has been proven. If you read Empty Planet, it's a good book that people can go look at that has all the statistics for that. But there's this Bill Gates and these others at Davos. They have this idea that we need to control the climate because we're all going to basically be extinct if we don't lower the Earth's atmosphere temperature, and you need to do that by complying with X, Y, and Z and paying a little bit extra on everything and not having gas heating in your house and so forth. But there's too many people, and I've run across this with so many intellectuals, especially left-wing intellectuals, that say, well, less people, that's a good thing, isn't it? I've literally been told that so many times, I lost count, Marcus. So, I mean, do you think that's the noble lie that many elites are using to justify what we're seeing happening right now?
Obviously, I don't know who these left-wing intellectuals are whom you have just referred to, but I think I should say that the genuine left-wing politics is dead and buried, and it has been for nearly 30 years now. People who refer to themselves today as left-wing or socialist have absolutely nothing in common with the fundamental pillars of socialism or communism or left-wing politics. In regard to the changes which are being imposed in the Western world by the ruling elites, undoubtedly there is an ideological element at play, and I believe that element is substantial. But I believe that possibly as significant as the ideological element is the element of control, specifically attaining a level of control over the minds of people that has never been attained before in human history. That is unprecedented. And I believe that that is partly what we are seeing today. Because if we take what is known as COVID-19, the official figures of the mortality rate in countries such as Britain, America, and Canada, for instance, range from 0.5% to 1%. Therefore, that tiny mortality rate in no way whatsoever justifies the response we have seen. No way it justifies that. And if the average person in Britain and America had an ounce of common sense, they would pose that actuality to their politicians and journalists. And I would say, ordinarily, I would say, Patrick, to the ordinary person in the US and the UK, to read not just the works of Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, but also to read the works of ancient Greek and ancient Roman philosophers about how essentially power corrupts. But alas, most people in Britain and America today either have no interest in reading or quite simply cannot read. Well, they certainly can't read sentences which they would find in the works of Plato or Aldous Huxley. They can just about read the sentences of degenerate and idiotic Hollywood celebrities. But answering your question, I believe it's ideological, but I also believe it is about control. I believe that under the cover of what the ruling elites in the Western world refer to as a pandemic, they are introducing a form of society, for instance, a cashless society, which will ultimately lead to the ruling elites acquiring vast amounts of data, of information on what a person is doing in their day-to-day lives, what a person is buying in their day-to-day lives, what a person is thinking in their day-to-day lives, and where a person is going in their day-to-day lives. That has not been accomplished before in human history. Some commentators like to refer to the countries in Eastern Europe which once made up the Soviet fraternal camp, such as East Germany. But quite frankly, the practices which were introduced in East Germany to carry out surveillance on its population were practices which had been employed by states and empires throughout history. Yes, of course, the methods differed slightly because the technology had evolved, but the mindset was still the same. However, what we see in the Western world makes the practices in East Germany or Nazi Germany or fascist Italy seem, in relative terms, well, put it like this, Patrick. I don't believe that people like Aldous Huxley or George Orwell would quite believe what has happened in the Western world. I think they would have looked at Nazi Germany and they would have looked at fascist Italy and they would have looked at, for example, East Germany, and they would have concluded that is what human beings are capable of, and that is what we have been writing about. But I don't believe they could have ever have foreseen what has happened, what is happening in both Britain and in America, because it is so extraordinary, it is untrue. Because people in East Germany, people in Nazi Germany, for instance, were still thinking independently and were still thinking critically. Yes, they could not speak out in public, but in private, they were expressing their opinions. But in Britain and America, which we are told are free and independent societies, people are not just complying, people are willingly complying with not just idiotic measures, but dangerous measures. Idiotic measures such as walking into a restaurant wearing a mask, walk into a table wearing a mask, but once you've sat down, you can take that mask because you've been told by your politicians and your journalists that you'll be safe. It doesn't dawn on them, as I said, that they are in an enclosed area, breathing in and breathing out the same oxygen as other people in the restaurant. So that is why I believe that philosophers from ancient times and visionaries such as Huxley and Orwell would never have been able to foresee the transformation in British and American societies, because it's not just that societies in Britain and America today contain elements from, for example, East Germany or fascist Italy or Nazi Germany. It is more than that. And I believe that unless a halt is put to this, and I doubt very much a halt will be put to this in the Western world, but unless a halt is put to this, then the Western ruling elites will have achieved a level of control, perhaps absolute control, over the minds of their subjects that has never been witnessed before, not just in contemporary history, but throughout the whole of human history.
Yes. And they've gathered such an enormous amount of wealth, power, influence, control, as you said, in a very short space of time. If you look at who's a lot of the big players at the top of this pyramid, and through digital technology, they've amassed all this wealth, influence, power, and so forth. Bill Gates is just one example of that. But the last thing I'm going to ask you is, what do you think the psychology behind elite agendas is? There's people who would say that there would have to be, because we're talking about people at the end of the day, they're still human, at least somewhat, that what's motivating them is that, if you probably are familiar with these sort of characteristics looking back at empires in history, but if one is to attain a certain amount of power and wealth and sees themselves as successful, deserving of their position, and therefore qualified to exert their influence or their vision or their ideology, but is not content to see this happening in the future, in the next generation, is obsessed perhaps with seeing it happen in their own lifetime. So one could use the word vanity. Are we talking about simple base level, looking back at history, that, if you're looking at this archetype, what are the big motivators?
I believe the big motivators include satisfying the egos of many who form the ruling elites in the Western world. I would say not just egos, but such people are, quite frankly speaking, are egomaniacs. They are narcissists, and indeed they are psychopaths. And I mean psychopaths in its actual definition, not the Hollywood definition. I mean the actual definition. For instance, resorting to any measures, including the metaphoric destroying of people's lives in order to attain goals for your success, for your own self. So I believe that these people who make up the ruling elites in the Western world see a golden opportunity before them to not just accumulate even more influence and power for themselves, not just even more wealth, prosperity for themselves, but even more control for themselves, and to increase their status, or their statuses, beyond all imagination. And yet, Patrick, if we didn't have in Britain and in America and in Canada, by and large, such stupid populations, such superficial populations, then these putrid people who are ruling us, who are dictating to us, who are imposing their ways on us, could be brought down from power. They could be brought down from power, Patrick, by people simply saying, no, I will not comply with those measures. No, I will use these words. If people en masse said no to the British ruling elite, to the American ruling elite, and to the Canadian ruling elite, for instance, then overnight you would see the aforementioned elites start to back off. But it would have to be not a minority of people saying no, it would have to be the majority of people saying no. Because the hold that the ruling elites in the Western world have over their subjects is, quite substantially speaking, a psychological hold. Once that psychological hold has been broken, then quite simply, the ruling elites in the Western world would lose a vast amount of their power, because how else would they maintain their power? They're not going to deploy the army, soldiers and tanks onto the streets and massacre hundreds and thousands of their own peoples. Not that in their hearts of hearts they would object to that. I don't think they would object to that in their hearts of hearts, given their disdain for their own peoples. But they know that if they were to do that, the West overnight would lose its image completely. The image of democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. That would be gone overnight. So even though they might want to use tanks to put down protests, they would never resort to, well, they certainly won't resort to that at present and for the foreseeable future. But if people actively defied them by saying, no, you will not tell me what to do. You will not impose your ways on myself, or my family members, including my children. You will not do that. If the vast majority of people in the Western world said no to their ruling elites, then the ruling elites would start to back off, and in fact, I believe would back off very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not even a majority, even 20 or 30% with momentum would be enough. Just the momentum would be enough. I agree. Well, we'll wrap up in a second, but yeah, what you said about the old left is so true. If Tony Benn were around, I'm pretty certain he'd be opposing all of this tooth and nail. But sadly, that breed of statesman is no more, unfortunately.
Indeed.
Classic liberal values. But listen, that's all we've got time for. We've gone a little bit over time, but it was a fascinating discussion. And, like always, Marcus, we've only really scratched the surface of this. So hopefully this dialogue will continue. We can definitely direct people to your Twitter account. You're still on Twitter, so follow Marcus Papadopoulos on Twitter, but also follow the links to his book as well. Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics is a fantastic historical book, and also the culmination of years of Marcus's research and studies in this field, a specialist on Russia, especially in history, British history and Russian history. But we want to thank you very much, Marcus, for joining us this week on the Sunday Wire.
I thank you, Pete. I thank you, Patrick, for having had me on. It's been of immense pleasure to discuss critical issues with you.
Yeah, no, pleasure. The pleasure is all ours. So hopefully we'll continue this discussion, hopefully in the future on this or other programs, I hope, because there's so much that we need to do in this area. But thank you again. And Marcus, the best place to get a hold of your book is that going to be Amazon?
either that outlet, or people can order directly from the publishing house, which is in California.
Okay. Well, we put a link to on the show page as well, straight there. You can see the options there. Google it for the best deal. Yes, directly from the publisher if you're able. But that's it for this week on this segment. And thank you, Marcus. And we're going to take